it's sort of following this sort of like on the dialogue with what happens with this movement of the book. So that's something that's the third sort of like register of gesture, which is something which has no relation whatsoever with the film, but it's just part of this, like, okay, this is happening at the same time.
It's also it's also just a passing detail, though,
Right.
that is actually quite indicative of the dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
Shannon.
Well, there's something else too, because, you know, I've seen the movie many, many times, of course not as many times as Andy.
Well, you probably have seen
And I've seen the performance many times, of course not as many times.
probably
as
more
Andy.
than me.
However, so there's a couple things that jump to mind. There's this, you know, at the end, Francesco, in the fourth scene where you're playing Jimmy Stewart sitting down, there's this thing that you do with your hands that the more times I watch it, has become almost impersonation. Like it has this real kind of like Jimmy Stewart kind of like, well, whatever. And that's really funny to see, like once we see it enough times, we start to look at the repetition in a different way, right? Seeing how there's a kind of neutrality with gestures, but also we can't help but sneak a little personality in there.
Well, also because
And then there's something, well, Michael was talking the other day about how Farley Granger is so, his face never stops moving in the movie.
yeah.
So I'm hearing it's just like, So you watch Michael's face very carefully, there's all these, like, when he turns and does the mouth thing, you know, there's all these.
Frank, I'm going to take the effort.
Yeah, or the slap, which is like, the reaction is so ridiculous. It's like a very sort of Farley Granger kind of.
That's another thing that I think about today, where with the voices being louder, it's easier to distinguish them. And there are moments when I'm watching maybe one performer, but I'm hearing another of the voices. And again, that also throws a weight to the James Stewart character, because I think because that actor's voice is so much familiar than the other characters' voices. I mean, I grew up listening to, "Hi, I'm Jimmy Stewart, and I'm going to read you all about Winnie the Pooh." And it's like, you know, like that voice. You know, and then later on you see these movies in which Mr. Middle America is actually kind of a wacko. Whatever. I also wouldn't mind shifting a little bit to maybe talk about possible intersections between some modern dance practices and also experimental music. Wouldn't mind getting you chatting about some of those, because I see this performance kind of entering that domain of a certain type of dance piece where there's some blocking, but there's also room for indeterminate elements. And maybe we might want to also talk about parallels and differences between indeterminacy and improvisation, because I don't believe they're the same thing. And also some concrete-ish music, newish music pieces. I mean, yes, we are getting into John Cage and Merce Cunningham territory here. I think it is interesting that a film by possibly the most notoriously control-oriented film director of all time, namely Hitchcock or whatever, might serve as a springboard for a performance that works and permits and encourages indeterminacy and accidents and works outside of the terrain of that is right and that is not right, where there is room for what can't even be called mistakes, because we're not even operating within a vocabulary of correct and incorrect.
Yes. No, I mean, yeah, I think that probably Kara, Martin, and Michael can probably talk about what's happening in dance more than I can. I mean, what I can say about the connection to music is that it is the smaller version. Well, the version of this piece that's based on the score has always been. I always performed it in experimental music context. This is the first time that that this is presented as something other than an experimental music piece. So definitely that's and in the way I sort of composed this in terms of scene choice and sort of like time for each scene. That's very much
In
what
space between different sound sources,
yeah,
with the positioning of the bodies, with the choice of scenes,
yeah,
where what we were talking about, like the Brandon and Phillips scenes, they tend to be more of a proximity with just the two of them, and that's a different
Yeah.
audio
So
dynamic.
it does definitely become sort of a very, very perversely convoluted procedure to generate a chance score to evoke the ghost of the above mentioned Cage, and
We don't talk about it that much unless you want to.
and also chance procedure to generate dance, or like spatial arrangements
Yeah.
and movement, and so definitely I definitely I don't know enough about dance to say how relevant this is in terms of what's happening.
I just
in
put
dance
that
right now,
out so people might tell me more, so let's hear more.
Oh, yeah.
Dancers.
No,
Shannon.
well, you know, we were just joking after the performance about, for Michael, for Kara, you know, you should put it in your dance reel when you go to audition for something. It's kind of very, and look, I'm a dancer.
Well, it's modern, because you can definitely do modern.
So I'm just wondering if you could say something about what it's like for you, coming from your own practices and your own sort of process to work this work.
Please do.
You first.
Well, you know, I have a little bit of training in Buto, and so that is also a very internal, kind of task-based, image-based dance form. And so for me, the link of this work and with any kind of Buto work that I've done, it's like, yeah, of course I imagine myself, you know, aging from 0 to 100, and that's the piece, and what manifests, you know, in the body is just sort of the trace of that. So for me, there's a huge link there. But yeah, I've done a lot of work.
That's
in-
why you had the Japanese looking curtain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've done a lot of, you know, task-based sort of dance, which is something that's kind of hot right now as well, where it's just really about completing this thing, whether it be a mental gymnastic or something more physical.
Yeah, and my dance experience has been a lot, not in sort of task-based performance, more in very formal, very set choreography, you know, on stage, very theater-type dance. But two things I want to bring up. The one that, Andy, you actually brought up in your essay, is this whole idea of mistakes, and that, you know, in live performance, a dance or theater, mistakes happen all the time, but the idea is that you move through them and you don't let anyone see them, right? Well, here, I mean, you see all of them. Like, there's no hiding any of those mistakes.
Yeah, but I also
so kind of
meant to
wrapping around
say
there.
that in some ways we're working within a framework
Mhm.
in which there is, like a mistake is, there's a difference between, well, that's not quite the gesture, so I'll give it another try and I can get it even better and I'll repeat and I'll go back to the same spot. But that is, it's a given that one can do that,
Mhm.
which is a very different vocabulary that I think parallels the fact that this film, the source film, celebrates a type of amorality, a type of Nietzschean amorality, but of course there has to be a punishment in the end because of the Hays Code and Hitchcock himself being such a fucking Victorian, whatever. But
The second point I want to make, actually,
Sure.
before you move on, and came up for me very recently is this whole idea of body memory, because with dancers, you know, you practice something over and over again. Some of the dancers in the crowd, you almost don't think about what you're doing anymore. It happens physically through your body memory, whatever that term means for a lot of people. But here you almost have to shut that off because the attention always has to be on the film and what you have seen in the film and your representation of the film. Not so if I do the slap gesture, it's not that I'm it's not that I want to remember what my body does. I want to have it fresh in my memory and in my mind every time I do it, so that I'm always referencing the film and not my own internal memory of it.
right.
If that makes any sense.
That was something that was actually challenging in the rehearsal process. I mean, this is something that in a very sort of, that was, I've never had the luxury of this much time of rehearsal. And so one of the things is that it becomes harder and harder to think about the film. I mean, you think about certain solutions that you found. And this actually came up a little less than a month ago. We were like, okay, this looks good, but it's starting to look kind of too good. There's too many things that are sort of like feel right. And of course that's fine to a certain extent, but it's hard to keep referring to the film and not to this memory that builds up of solutions that you found to meet those sound cues and so on. One thing, in terms, just to go very briefly, that this reminded me of something, to go very briefly back to the music issue. So another way in which I was thinking about this in terms of like composing a music piece is that there's an extent to which you can sort of influence the way each scene will look and sound by rehearsing it more or less. Because there's a way in which the more you rehearse it, the more you become familiar with the material, the more fragmented it becomes, because there's more details that each of us will want to account for. So the sound will be choppier, and the gestures will be choppier. And so the finer the sort of the memory of the scene, the more fragmented and thick the scene becomes. The looser your memory is, if you rehearse something a couple of times, you sort of like, people tend to go through longer chunks of sound because it's like, okay, I start here and I end up here along, and there's like, I don't remember exactly this happens here or not, and so you go through longer moments of sound. So there's a way in which I try to sort of rehearse scenes at a different level of detail to keep that, different density in different scenes. I don't know if that worked. I mean, we're becoming so familiar with the material now that after a while you lose control on that because everything becomes so familiar.
It became faster today.
It did.
It was less than an hour.
Yeah.
Why do you think that was?
I don't know.
We were so
audience?
excited.
One of my ambiguities about performing is no matter how modernist I might sort of feel about schmaudience, that's countered by a sort of thing is like the last thing you do is bore the audience, which means you might make the mistake of accentuating the obvious or speeding things up and neglecting the texture. I don't think you were doing that.
There could be something, there's definitely one inevitably reacts to the presence of other people in the room or not, so there might have been a little bit of that. And there is also this issue of, the piece becoming familiar, which I think it's a real difficulty in this kind of work. I don't know if we could do this many more times.
Isn't one of the dictums of this general series of performances, and this is not maybe in the same series, that the scenes are supposed to be almost 3 times the length of the source?
Yeah, that's another stipulation in the original score, that we don't apply here very strictly, but in the original score, the scene is, there's a saturation that's predetermined. And
there are some scenes for which you had an alarm set,
right,
in case they went too long. Ding. I was hoping there might be one of those, especially the scenes where, can somebody please answer the phone? Like bing, ding, ding, and then suddenly, and it's like that completely changes.
Yeah. So, but we
Or just the absurdity of, the absurdity of the alarm introduction is something that's supposed to have an indeterminate encouragement, the contradiction of like the alarm clock saying, stop whatever you're doing right at this.
Well, in a way, but though that is not, it's not really a contradiction because the frame and the structure are very predetermined. It's whatever happens within those cells that it's indeterminate, but the juxtaposition and the sequencing and the duration here was also indeterminate because we decided to just end and then start the new scene. The original piece requires that there's a set duration and the performers just wait until the duration expires if they finish earlier. So we had a few rehearsals like that where we were just like hanging out waiting for the alarm clock. That's something where I just like, I don't know, I felt it didn't work with this kind of
I like the humor, though, of sometimes the disconnect between the fact that one of the four of you, or one of the performers, would take longer to resolve than the others. But I mean, that's also like my own interest in certain bits of dialogue filtering through the cacophony. The unusual emphasis on, what is the line? I don't think I'm in the mood for ice cream tonight, or something like that. I mean, it can't be once. 5 times, it's like, oh my God. But just hearing the top scene more clearly this time, what's the line that kept repeating? The only crime is
Being weak is being a mistake. That one?
Yeah,
That line.
being weak. Oh God, we don't remember it. Being weak is a mistake.
Yeah.
Because it's being
The
human,
only-
because it's being
the only
ordinary.
crime is making a mistake or something like
Yeah,
that.
being weak is
And it's like, well, yeah, that puts Nietzsche right at the top, and that sort of is going to determine everything else we see or hear, like that sort of Nietzschean premise. I guess if there's curiosity, is there anyone in the audience who
It's Nietzsche.
didn't know the original film at all, who wondered what, plots might be, or was concerned with that, or was trying to figure out what was going on other than what you were seeing? Johannes Stitch, yes.
I hadn't seen the film for a long time, so I really couldn't comprehend what was going on. And I also didn't know, well, I had some basic questions even now, like, is what you did today the same as what you did yesterday? And you're doing it again on Wednesday?
Tuesday.
Is it again a repeat of what you did today?
Not an exact repeat.
No, I know, not an exact repeat, but the same scenes and the same audio.
The same scenes and the same audio, that's
So in
right.
other words, it would be an reinterpretation of what you did today.
Well, the task remains the same, and the
Yeah.
structure remains the same, and within that structure, things shift. I mean, for instance, every day, I think there's a different person ends the scene, you
Yeah.
know, there's, who ended the show tonight?
I
You
did.
did, but Kara did
Yeah,
earlier,
just the lights
and
going
I
on.
did yesterday, I think I ended the show, just because every time, people take sort of longer, so everything that happens within each of the cells or scenes or completely changes. So spatial relationship changes, the audio, the way the audio layers changes, and so on. So it is the same and it isn't.
Somebody over here, yeah.
I've never been to Rome, and I didn't really know anything about it coming into the performance. So I found it interesting that as I was watching, I felt myself getting invested in scenes. It was like, oh man, what's gonna happen next? Feeling like I actually knew what was going on. Feeling like I was getting to know characters and stuff. So yeah, sorry.
No, sorry, actually. Do you pick up on sort of the dynamic in the relationship between this character and that character? Because performers did choose to correspond to a particular character in the film.
Yeah, fragmentally, you felt like you were watching a coherent scene when actually it wasn't. So I thought it was interesting that maybe the intent for the performers was to be kind of like a conduit for the performances of a film, but you actually felt like it was expressive. At least to me, I felt like it was like I was watching people emote.
I couldn't even figure if you guys were all playing different characters. Like at some point, I'm wondering if the two of you guys were playing the same character, but at a different time. So,
Well, funnily enough, I think in the movie the characters, Philip takes on the characteristics of Brandon at some point too. So there's a really funny cross-fertilization of personality in the film as well at certain points. So I think it's an interesting comment.
But with regard to the plot situation, Philip is what the late Margaret Thatcher's double, what's her name, Anne Robertson, would call the weakest link. Yeah, Pam.
I'm thinking about this in a slightly different way from the four of themselves are taken and placed into a different context. So I've never seen rope before, but it didn't matter to me. So I got involved very much in the process and the investment in the actions. So for me, what you as performers brought to the structure, which was something which was very alive for me. I remember Barbara calling this sort of the sax point, this place, this in-between place. And that was, so it was not important for me to know what the subtext was.
Yeah, I was.
What was interesting was how you invested the action with a sense of presence. And I was able to say it doesn't matter, you know. This is very interesting for me just because I'm involved with how you occupy those actions as performers.
And I think from a dance context, like, in going through this process, it's like, yeah, of course, this is choreography. These are just, you know, gestures that.
It's choreography too.
A little bit, but in terms of the spatial orientation.
And in theater and as a performance artist, and there's a very, and doing Butoh, so I understand there's a subtlety. Of course, I haven't danced for years, so it may have changed. Yeah. Sorry, go on, you were talking.
No, that was like.
No, I think your point's interesting. Any other reactions to like Pam's point, or, I mean, I'm not placing a value judgment on whether it's more important to know the source film or not. I'm interested in the different reactions from people who do and don't. Shannon.
Well, it's interesting this in-between place because, I mean, because like I said, I've seen the movie many times, so it's hard for me to unsee it, unknow it. But it does sit somewhere in between. I was talking to some people yesterday, and if you've seen the movie, you know, you go back and forth between trying to do this matchy thing. And if you haven't seen it, there's moments where you don't know what the fuck is happening, right? So it's this kind of weird, it does occupy this kind of weird.
Right. Because I mean, I like for instance, somebody talks about music, a lot of reference to this, but especially when you go to the orchestra and everyone's rehearsing their own individual parts of what they're going to play, but it's at the same time, so it's like this big cacophony of sound, which I think is really awesome. Like that's more interesting than when they start. I mean, it's just a beautiful time, and the whole audience is just like they don't care, they're not really listening to it. But I think that's that's an amazing moment, I think, for me, because it does superimpose the different time periods, and it's like if things meet up, it's accidental, but it's actually way more interesting.
And it's also like the practicing. There's no separation between rehearsal and performance, which in a way comes back to the fact is like you're free to try things out, and there's actually no such thing as a mistake.
It's beyond good and evil. That's your Nietzschean.
And something that, just reacting to what Marcin was saying, to what was being said what Pam was saying, for me, there's something about that quality of concentration, but not what is present in this case. Like, presence keeps breaking, right? We are used to perform, and there's the sense of a consistency of presence, whereas here it's like you are in and out. I kept referring to the idea of marking. When you have a scene and you're just going through it, it's like, okay, I'm doing this, and then I do this, and then I do this thing here, and when you go to a rehearsal, like a theater rehearsal or a dance rehearsal, that's for me a thrilling moment when I see people sort of go through this thing of sort of everybody sort of doing this. I mean, this, I guess, it's my original interest in this, the idea of the mental performance, right? And there you see really a wonderful sort of physical manifestation of some very, very private thing that's going on. And sometimes, you know, there's this chance. And so this was a way of trying to, just like sort of trying to set up strategies or set processes in motion that might generate that kind of concentration and that kind of presence, which is like you're completely focused, but you are not doing it. You are thinking about it. You are sort of marking it, and or like the orchestra, sort of like just like everybody sort of, or opera singers when they sing it, but not like in full voice because they are rehearsing like for the director or something. Yeah. So there's something that I find very interesting from a performative point of view in that quality of presence, which.
Right. And some of my own baggage is about the architectural plan. When I think, because I have to think about, I studied architecture, so that's my kind of background. But you know, the plan is this space where it's totally controlled, and and it's a single vision, basically well defined. But I've been trying to think about what is a kind of map or a kind of plan that can incorporate multiple realities, multiple time periods, like different ways of thinking, all existing in one space, right? Like how can we like superimpose like various registers of realities, which is I think like the contemporary city. Like if you really care about the city, you have to try to deal with multiple realities coexisting in one space. But
Right.
usually the way we represent that hides that, right? But I think this one of the things that's made me think about is like a possible kind of mapping of
Yeah, why hide it?
Yeah.
Why not enter them into dialogue?
right.
Michael, you were gonna say something?
No.
Anyone in the audience have any more to say? Yeah.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but in different performances like this that you stage, you used like actors or dancers or performance artists.
A lot of them were just me. It was like solo pieces or
But
just like two
musicians
people.
too, though, right?
Yeah, and I worked a lot with musicians, like experimental musicians. So it would be me and someone else that has. It's the first time that I worked with dancers. I did a couple with actors, but most of them was with musicians.
It strikes me that it'd be very different if a method actor were involved. At one point, I think Hitchcock wanted Montgomery Clift, and was it the role that Farley Granger did? I'm now trying to imagine, like, the method actor component of Montgomery Clift trying to connect.
But see, the funny thing about method acting is that this whole project about mental activities as a performance, for me, came out of my puzzlement about method acting. I mean, I was trained in theater in Europe, where like not sort of like wasn't psychological or. And then when I moved to North America, I realized that that's very much the paradigm. Is this, and I always had found very puzzling this idea that you have to feel it, and if you feel it, it manifests itself in the right way. And so I started reading. I was musing with the idea of finding a teaching job in theater, which obviously didn't happen. And I was like, okay, let's see what. I went and read the Stanislavski books, and all the stuff that's behind method acting. And what really struck me is that there is this perverse reading of Stanislavski that is there, which is that the real performance is private, because it really does, if you are in the right set of states, in the right order, it manifests. And then, of course, he's writing at a certain time, so you have to stylize it, you have to sort of like trim it a little bit. But if you are in the right sort of mental state, and everything about the training in Stanislavski is about directions, about things you have to think, ways you have to feel, memories you have to squeeze at the right moment. And I found that was fascinating. And so part of the project was just to try and take that literally and sort of see like, well, let's see what happens if you really make it private. And so, I ended up reading Moby Dick, skipping every second word on my own, which wasn't very interesting, but it was real thing was happening in there. So the whole project about mental tasks, or sort of like moving the side of the performance inside, and just like it's sort of like exploring that very territory, but because I think that a lot of the sort of North American translation of Stanislavski, but well, any translation of Stanislavski in sort of in theatrical term, sort of is then ambiguous on what's going on. There's a lot of sort of like outside in that's kind of happening.
And a lot of those movies aren't that much to look at because they're so actor-oriented. They're so inward, they're not very outward. Yeah.
I have a question. Could you talk about your choice to use the cassette recorder or the cassette tape as first of all, maybe how was it used
Good question.
as a tool, and why specifically that technology?
I like the sound of it very much.
I do think of John Cage and David Tudor.
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess I sort of like, I wasn't trying to make the reference, but the reference is there and I'm happy with it. It's a certain tradition of music. But I also really like the sound. I like that you hear the rewind, that is part of the which you wouldn't with the digital. I like the way it sounds. I like the way it sounds when you put in the cassette. I mean, I like all of that clacking, clinking, clack.
It's in keeping with all of the analog nature of this particular edition of the Images Festival. You're someone who's been going to quite a few programs and noticed that the analog is being celebrated in many.
For sure, yeah. Well, the connection for me was thinking about the film and how Hitchcock was staying true to the length of these film reels. In a sense, that was the timing structure for your scenes, from what I could understand.
Right. Yeah.
So it kind of knitted itself nicely back into that.
Yeah.
That's a good question, actually.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Just a little while ago, you were talking about these private mental tasks that, as performers, all of you were preoccupied with and guided by. Given that, how would you say your sort of relationship to the audience is affected by that? Because at times, as a viewer, I felt like there was this kind of wonderful distance between me sitting, watching, and what all of you were doing. So I don't know. I guess for all of you, how did this particular performance and the series of tasks therein affect or manifest itself in terms of your relationship to us, the audience?
Shall I go for it first? But I'm curious to hear what other you guys were thinking. For me, that's very much my attitude towards the audience every time. I mean, all of my work. I mean, I'm trying out something and then I'm sharing whatever I'm doing with an audience, but I'm not addressing the audience ever. I mean, I'm not thinking about the audience when I make the work. I'm not addressing myself to the audience. I think my utmost respect for the audience is manifests itself in sort of in really wanting to sort of like say, this is where I'm at, this is what I'm doing, but I'm not sort of like, so the distance that you perceive is built into certainly this process and probably my process in general is I don't sort of like create it with an audience in mind or with a relation with the audience in mind. I don't know if that answers the question, but I mean I understand why this would feel sort of like it is. I mean, and the setup itself is very similar.
And it's another area where there's a very significant distinction between this style of performance and acting and method acting, which you were referring to a bit earlier, where the performer and the way in which the performer engages the audience is far more direct.
At the same time, in method acting, I mean, the sort of the theoretic, the premise is that you are acting as if the audience wasn't there. So there is also that thing is that you are on your own with this memory or with this task or something. So the wall is there in method acting, I think, very much.
Yeah. Why Marlon Brando was known as Mumbles.
But it's an interesting question. I mean, because in the Hitchcock film, the audience is in the first instance, it's this camera that's moving on, has a life of its own, and is also guiding your attention, but in a very complex way, right? And on the other hand, there's a space, for example, like a Gothic painting space, where you're looking at this painting, and it's if a figure is very important, this figure is like huge, right? And it's kind of in the scene, and the patrons are hanging out beside him, like very small, but seemingly in the same space. And there could be this other, maybe there's like other not terrestrial space existing within that space. So I think from that point of view, I think the audience is important for me because it's over here. Like the fact that I have to at some point actually like cover the whole audience, right? Because the screen turns black, and I have to do something where I'm like I have to basically become this monster, or just like a giant black sheet that kind of covers the audience. So from my point of view, I'm like, okay, so that's my relationship to the audience. Cover them with a blanket.
I was wondering what was going on.
Yeah. Those are some of the mascots, right? I guess what it's like, it's where the camera, because the whole length of the camera reel, but then sometimes he had to cheat, and so he would close up on a black thing
Right,
and then go up. And usually the black thing it was John Dahl's black jacket. So that's Marcin sort of doing a blackout.
Well, a really interesting thing, because in rehearsal, we were all able at some point to, one of us sit out and watch a scene and just be a sort of an audience member ourselves and be a spectator. And what I found really interesting when that happened was that I realized, oh wait, this is a live performance, but I actually feel like I'm watching a film. Like I'm actually, and you know how when you have that relationship with the film, like there's a screen up there and it's far away, and I do have that distance, and sometimes you do get engaged with the performances and whatnot, but you do have that distance away from, you know, Lord of the Rings or whatever else is going on up there, you know? And I find that really interesting, is that watching this, for me, like, it's like watching a film. Yeah, it kind of takes on that idea.
In terms of images filling up a space?
Yeah, and in terms of, you know, the distance you feel from what you're watching.
Yeah, in terms of like, I guess, it's like what goes on does not respond to the audience the way film does, and some performance art or some live performance does. I mean, there's a sense in which you sort of like, in fact, there's a lot of performances and experimental theater that are built around sort of reacting to the audience and trying to making eye
But it's
contact
interesting
with
with
everybody, and that kind of thing. And this is very much not so. I mean, in this respect, it's more like the rules of cinema or with very conventional theater, right? Where it's like, there's the fourth wall or something.
But in a way that's very different than Hitchcock and the suspense film, which plays on identification. And Rope played, it varies from wanting Brandon and Philip to get away with it because their premise is so outrageous, like why? We'll kill the guy right at, it's a reverse murder mystery. We'll kill David, who is not strange. We'll kill David because he's normal. You know, therefore he doesn't deserve to live because he's so normal. You know, at the top of the film, and we'll hide him right under the nose. There he is, right under there. There's a body in there. How long before it begins to stink? You know, how long can this sustain? And there's an identification, and it's set up just like other Hitchcock movies where you want Anthony Perkins to sink the fucking car or whatever, and then sooner or later, elements come into play. The audience is set up to identify more and more with the James Stewart character, who has put all this in motion with his teaching Nietzsche to these impressionable rich brats. But at the same point, it's like it has to be resolved. So sooner or later, the James Stewart character becomes a kind of detective surrogate. And those are the conventional modes of identification and representation in classic film or suspense film, that a lot of experimentation in film and a lot of people questioning the structures of experimental film, of conventional film, have wanted to rupture and get away from. Like Godard with his Brechtian influences, or European films that will put the Hollywood film in quotation marks while not adhering to its structures. So, yeah.
I want Christina Battle to say what she said to me back there before.
Please do, Christina.
About how this performance at a film festival.
Oh.
Say it.
If I can remember, because when Francesca, we were talking about future performances potentials and how this fits into a film festival or not, sort of questioning that. And in some ways, to me, this fits in a film festival more than some films fit in a film festival.
Which films might you mean, my dear?
No, just, in general. Because it's entirely cinematic in a lot of ways. And I mean, it really is like this recreation of a film and the process of filmmaking and all of these things tied into one.
I love that.
But reenactment is quite big in this year's edition of the Images Festival. Reenactment has been rather big in other editions of the Images Festival.
But I think,
It's
I
quite
guess
big in the
what you're
art
talking about tomorrow maybe, or I think that's maybe what that panel is about.
I
But for me, this is more than reenactment.
Oh, yeah.
And, yeah, all of the conversations.
It forms images, but the images themselves, you have to be there to see it, which makes it like the live performance. You know, or the theater, or like live music. If you weren't there, you missed it. Anyone else? How are we doing for time?
We're good.
John? You said something? No? Do people maybe, if people have no more questions, they want to maybe socialize and chat, or?
Just out of curiosity thing about playing the film before you do the performance, and how that would shift our perceptions of what you've done. I'm just throwing that out there. Knowing, seeing the film first,
Yeah.
and then doing the performance.
As an
after.
audience member, you mean,
Yes.
or for?
Or for the actors to see it
No,
before?
no.
Oh,
As an audience
For the
member.
audience to see it.
Yeah, I really don't know. I mean, I'm really curious, and we've been talking about this a lot. I'm quite with Pam on the thing that I don't know that it would. I mean, it would be different.
Yes.
For sure. I don't really think it's better or worse, or I just think
I
it would be a
agree.
very different thing, but I don't think it, I wouldn't sort of like recommend people to watch it before.
That's what I'm gonna do on Monday and on Tuesday.
No, but I mean, I'm not even saying like people, oh, don't watch it because otherwise you'll spoil it. I mean, I think it's just a very different, I don't know. I also I'm a very, and part of this thing is like I'm a very bad sort of like narrative film. I don't understand plots most of the time. I have to sort of like ask whoever is watching. I'm that person who's like, what? I mean, I don't understand this. So I mean, I mean, plots for me are very. It's something that I'm not. So really, I don't.
Right, but I mean, from my perspective, instead of watching Rope, you might be better off watching Braveheart and then trying to reenact it on the street. Monday night before seeing this Tuesday.
Does anybody here know the Leopold Loeb case that Rope, which was adapted from a play called Rope's End by a British writer named Patrick Hamilton? It might be interesting to watch Tom Kallen's movie Swoon, which is adapted from the same case. There's also Compulsion by Richard Fleischer, a B director, which focuses more on the trial of the Brandon and Philip character. I think in that movie they have different names, you know, John and Wayne or something, Dick and Wayne or something. But they're
Yes, because this is a true story.
yeah. I mean, Compulsion focuses on the Orson Welles is in there and the lawyer. And I know I have a friend who's into plot-oriented cinema who prefers Compulsion to Rope. It's like, yeah, but Compulsion, half of it is Orson Welles just as the lawyer, and he's not even in the same room as all the others. It's just Orson Welles getting a paycheck by going rap, 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 rap. It's this lawyer.
That's amazing.
Well, also, I mean, the process of performance is made, so I think it's really important that it's this movie. But when Francesca and I started talking about it, remember we were talking about this plan we had for Nuit Blanche? So to take the kind of process, like the process of making this sort of work, and applying it to any sort of film. So we decided that an amazing thing to do would be to take Ben-Hur and like, stage it in Lambton Arena or whatever. So in Ben-Hur, of course, what you need then is like 400 extras. So for the close-ups, you have like 400 people running.
Can I suggest
Like watching movies now that we're so.
Can I suggest?
And training the horses.
Can I suggest King Kong instead of Ben?
Yeah, we do. Yes, you can.
But yeah, in Ben-Hur, you have also to train the horses to do the
How,
thing.
it's so complex.
Yeah.
Nuit Blanche 2016.
Yeah. I mean, the birds I understand. More than any other Hitchcock, the birds make sense, I think,
Yeah.
in terms of, well, there's the special effects and then, oh yeah, right, there were people.
Let's chat.
Let's
I